All right, welcome back, everyone. You know we love to dive deep here, and today we're going to get into something that I think is really, really fundamental to, well, frankly, just about everything. We're going to talk about how we build healthy relationships, not just with other people, but with ourselves too, and how those relationships and the attitudes we bring to them can help us heal and become stronger, even when things get tough. And I know you guys, our listeners, you're all about getting to the heart of things, understanding them deeply, but also you don't want to get bogged down, right? You want knowledge you can actually use.
Exactly. And that's what we're aiming for today. We're diving deep into a book called Understanding Human Nature by Alfred Adler. Now, these were actually public lectures, can you believe it? From way back in 1928.
Wow, almost 100 years ago.
I know, right? But what's amazing is how relevant his insights into human behavior still are today. Like, the core of how we interact with each other, how we function in society, hasn't really changed that much.
It's true. And what really struck me about Adler is that he was convinced that, messing up in our personal lives and our relationships, that's far more crucial than any mistake we could make in, say, business or science.
He really believed that, yeah.
So I think our mission today, and this is where it gets exciting for you guys listening, is to kind of pull out the juiciest, most useful ideas from Adler's work that can help us build those strong, healthy connections and that inner strength to heal and grow. It's like we're giving you a cheat sheet to understanding some pretty deep stuff about human nature.
Yeah, a fast track to Adler's brilliance. And I think a great place to start is with some of the core ideas that Adler emphasizes, and they're all kind of woven together, right? He talks a lot about social feeling, which is basically that deep sense of connection with other people, feeling like you belong, you're part of something bigger.
That makes sense.
And then there's this whole idea of inferiority feelings. We all have them to some extent, and how we deal with those feelings is really important. And then he goes into how our childhood experiences shape what he calls our style of life. It's like a blueprint that guides how we see the world and react to things, and that stays with us pretty consistently. And this is interesting. Adler was also way ahead of his time in criticizing the whole idea of rigid gender stereotypes. He saw right through that and how damaging it can be. But at the heart of it all is Adler's view that we're not just a bunch of separate parts. We're not just a mind, a body, and a personality that are all disconnected. He saw us as whole beings.
I like that. Indivisible. Okay, so let's dig into this indivisible whole thing. What does that actually mean for us practically?
Well, Adler believed that we're these interconnected organisms, right? Our minds and bodies are constantly influencing each other, and our personality is part of that whole package. You can't understand one without the other. It's all intertwined. And from this idea of the indivisible whole comes this concept of our style of life, which is so central to Adler's thinking.
So what is style of life exactly?
It's not just your favorite color or what kind of music you like. It's much deeper than that. It's a pattern that starts to develop super early in childhood, by the time we're 4 or 5 years old. And it basically dictates how we interpret our experiences and how we react to things throughout our lives. It's like a lens through which we see everything.
So are you saying those patterns we see in ourselves and other people, those tendencies, they really solidify that early?
Yeah, pretty much. And it stays relatively consistent. Adler would see adults who struggled with things like anxiety or a deep distrust of others, and he could trace those patterns back to their childhood. Maybe they were expressed in a more simple, childlike way back then, but the roots were there.
Wow, so you're saying our childhoods are kind of like the blueprint for how we navigate relationships as adults.
Exactly. That's why Adlerian psychology, it emphasizes understanding someone's childhood if you want to truly get them as an adult. It's like what we see in someone when they're grown up is often just a more complex version of those early patterns they developed.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It gives a whole new perspective on those challenges we all face in relationships. Now, you mentioned social feeling earlier as being crucial for healthy connections. What did Adler mean by that?
Well, he used the term Gemeinschaftsgefühl, which is a German word.
Of course it is.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to translate directly, but it's more than just being friendly or outgoing. It's this deep sense of human solidarity, feeling connected to humanity as a whole, feeling a sense of belonging to something much bigger than yourself.
So it's not just like being polite to the cashier at the store.
No, it's much deeper than that. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected and that we all have a responsibility to contribute to the well-being of everyone. And Adler argued that all the important things like justice, fairness, responsibility, loyalty even our love for truth, they all come from this basic need to live together in a community. Like, these things become virtues because they're essential for everyone to thrive.
I see. So it's like for society to work, we all need to have this social feeling?
Exactly. And it ties into our character, too. Adler believed that we judge character from the standpoint of society. Like, a person's value is measured by how much they contribute to humanity, how they handle life's challenges in a way that benefits everyone. And they do it with a highly developed sense of social feeling. They consider the impact of their actions on others.
So someone who really embodies this social feeling, they're like the ideal, well-adjusted human being.
Right, and Adler felt that you couldn't really become that kind of person without nurturing this connection to others, without actively participating in, like, he called it the art of being human within a community.
That's a cool way to put it. The art of being human.
Yeah.
Okay, so this social feeling is important, but what happens when our early experiences don't really foster that? We talked about the impact of childhood, but also societal influences. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. The way society works, its norms and expectations, they have a huge impact on our lives, on how our minds develop. Adler was a big believer in the importance of what he called a protecting community for healthy development. And that starts right from infancy. Like, think about a baby, completely dependent on others. They need consistent care, a sense of security to thrive.
It's basic, right?
Totally. But if a child doesn't get that, if their development is somehow disrupted, maybe because they have physical limitations that aren't handled sensitively, well, that can lead to a lot of problems. They might develop a sense of suspicion, a lack of trust in others, feeling isolated, and they might start to see the world as a hostile place, like it's not on their side.
And that must be so damaging to a child's sense of self, their ability to connect with others.
It really is. And it's the same with how parents express tenderness, or maybe don't express it enough. Like, if a child doesn't experience genuine tenderness, it can really shape their whole attitude towards relationships. They might avoid intimacy, have trouble recognizing and accepting love. But on the flip side, too much tenderness, over pampering, that can be just as bad. It can create this insatiable need for attention, make a child overly dependent and manipulative. Like, they think everyone owes them something just because they exist.
It sounds like finding that balance in early caregiving is so crucial.
It is. It really is. And Adler noticed that kids who are pampered all the time, they often develop this exaggerated sense of their own importance compared to other people. And that's a sign of underdeveloped social feeling. It can lead to this kind of pessimistic view of life, like they can't be happy unless their every whim is satisfied.
Yeah, I can see how that would set them up for difficulties later on.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've talked about social feeling, but let's move on to these feelings of inferiority that Adler talked about. What are those exactly, and how do they play into all of this?
So Adler believed that feeling inferior, feeling inadequate in some way, is a universal human experience. Like, we all feel it to some degree, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it can be a major driving force behind our growth and development.
So how does that work?
Well, when we feel inferior in some area, it can motivate us to learn, to improve, to strive for something better. It's like this engine that pushes us forward.
But I imagine there's a point where it becomes a problem.
Right. If these feelings of inferiority become too intense, maybe because of negative childhood experiences, it can lead to what Adler called a demand for overcompensation. So instead of striving for balance or improvement, a person might start seeking an excessive, even unrealistic sense of superiority.
So they're trying to overcompensate for feeling inadequate.
Exactly. And this can become a problem because it can hinder their ability to function in everyday life, to have healthy relationships. They're so focused on proving themselves that they can't really engage with others in a genuine way.
You mentioned a patient earlier who masked his need for dominance with a sense of duty. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, this was a patient who was constantly emphasizing his sense of duty, especially in his marriage. And on the surface, it sounded like a good thing, right? But Adler saw through it. He recognized that this was actually a way for this patient to control and dominate his wife. Like, his need for dominance was so strong that it was choking out any real social feeling in their relationship. It became all about power, not partnership.
Wow, so it's like the motivation behind the action gets twisted. Duty becomes a weapon instead of a shared value.
Exactly. And it's interesting how these feelings of inferiority can manifest in really indirect ways. Adler gave this example of a young girl who was actually very bright, but she started doing poorly in school on purpose. And the reason was she realized that by getting bad grades, she'd get more attention from her parents, even more than her brother, who was academically successful. So it was her way of compensating for feeling overlooked, trying to gain significance, even if it was negative attention.
It's like we don't always see the root of the behavior. It's often hidden beneath these feelings of inadequacy. Now, Adler also placed a lot of emphasis on education. How did he see education as playing a role in all of this?
Well, Adler was a huge proponent of education. He believed it was absolutely key for cultivating that social feeling we talked about, for helping people overcome those feelings of inferiority in a healthy way, and for instilling good values. And ultimately, he saw education as essential for developing a healthy lifestyle, which ties directly into building those positive attitudes we need to heal and grow.
So he wasn't just talking about academics, right? He saw education as something much broader.
Right. For him, it was about helping people become well-adjusted, contributing members of society. And he believed that psychological problems often arose when people adopted the wrong strategies for achieving their goals, which led to them feeling detached from their community. So the goal of education, and even therapy, was to help reintegrate them, to nurture that sense of belonging and the desire to contribute to the common good.
It's like he saw education as the key to unlocking our potential both individually and as a society. Now, something else that Adler talked about that I think is still so relevant today is his critique of gender stereotypes. Can you tell us more about his perspective on that?
Yeah, Adler was way ahead of his time in challenging those rigid stereotypes about men and women. He argued that they weren't based on any real differences between the sexes, but rather on what he called artificially nourished delusions of grandeur. Basically, he saw it as a way for men, especially privileged men, to hold on to their power and dominance.
That's a pretty radical view for the early 1900s.
It is. He pointed out that all these societal institutions, our laws, our morals, our customs, they all reflected this historical imbalance of power, and that it started influencing kids from a very young age. Like, even little boys having a strong aversion to wearing girls' clothes, he saw that as a sign of how deeply these societal expectations were ingrained.
Wow, so even those seemingly small everyday reactions can be a reflection of these much larger societal forces.
Exactly. And Adler argued that the very definition of what it meant to be masculine was often tied to these very egotistical traits, like a sense of superiority, the need to dominate others, this constant striving to be the best, to be on top. He even pointed to anthropological studies that showed that male dominance wasn't some natural, inevitable thing. Like, there were societies historically where women held more power. So he was saying that this male dominance, it was something that was fought for, something that was imposed and enforced.
It really makes you think about how these gender roles are constructed and how we can deconstruct them.
Right, and he saw how damaging this was for girls and women, constantly being told they were inferior. He felt it eroded their self-confidence, made it harder for them to face challenges head-on. He even identified different types of women that he observed, and he saw these as reactions to societal pressures, to this lack of equality. Like, some women might try to adopt more masculine traits to compensate or rebel, while others might internalize that message of inferiority and become submissive. But he saw these as unhealthy adaptations, ultimately. And that's one of the reasons why he was such a big advocate for coeducation, for boys and girls learning together. He thought it was crucial for building healthier relationships between the sexes. But he emphasized that it had to be done right. It had to be about preparing them to cooperate and respect each other, not just compete.
So dismantling those artificial barriers between genders was really important to him.
Absolutely. He believed that true equality was essential for everyone to thrive.
Okay, before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more thing. Vanity. Adler had some pretty strong opinions on that. Why did he consider vanity to be so unhealthy, especially when it comes to building healthy relationships?
Well, he saw vanity as the opposite of social feeling. It's all about prioritizing your own sense of superiority, even if it means putting others down or ignoring their needs. And that creates a huge barrier to real connection and empathy. Like, a vain person is so focused on their own image, on getting external validation, that they lose sight of the people around them. Their relationships become superficial and ultimately unfulfilling.
It's like vanity creates a wall between people.
Exactly. And while Adler recognized that ambition is part of human nature, he made a distinction between healthy ambition and unhealthy vanity. Like, he believed that truly great accomplishments, the kind that benefit everyone, they come from social feeling, from a genuine desire to contribute, not from this empty pursuit of personal glory. In fact, he thought vanity could actually hold people back from achieving their true potential because they're so focused on appearances rather than substance.
And what about those people who create all these elaborate conditions for cooperation? Like, they seem willing to work with others, but only on their own terms.
Yeah, Adler saw that as another form of vanity, a way to avoid taking real responsibility. Like, by setting up all these preconditions, they can always find an excuse for not fully participating or contributing. It's a way to protect their ego from failure or criticism. They want to look like they're team players without actually having to risk anything.
Wow, that's really insightful. This has been such a fascinating deep dive into Adler's work. As we wrap up, what are the key takeaways for our listeners who are really trying to build those healthy relationships, both with themselves and others, and cultivate those attitudes that can lead to healing and strength?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that it all starts with social feeling, that deep sense of connection and concern for others. And it involves understanding those often hidden feelings of inferiority, both in ourselves and others, and how they can drive our behavior. We need to be willing to challenge those harmful societal constructs, like those rigid gender roles that can limit us and create barriers between people. And fundamentally, it's about recognizing how destructive vanity can be and shifting our focus from trying to be superior to contributing to empathizing to really belonging to something larger than ourselves. It's about moving from a me focus to a we focus.
So understanding those fundamental drives within us, like social feeling and how we respond to feeling inadequate, and being aware of those societal messages that can shape our attitudes, that's where it all begins.
Exactly. And once you start to understand those things, the way Adler so brilliantly laid them out, it can really change how you see yourself, your relationships, your whole path to personal growth and healing. It can be incredibly powerful.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you all to ponder. What if you actively, consciously cultivated that social feeling in your own life? What if you made a real effort to focus on genuine connection, empathy, contributing to the well-being of others, instead of chasing that fleeting validation of feeling superior? How might that transform not only your relationships, but also your own inner resilience when you face those inevitable challenges in life? And maybe take some time to think about that style of life that we talked about, those patterns you developed early on. How are they still showing up in your life today? And what small steps can you take to nurture more social feeling in your everyday interactions? Food for thought. Right, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.